Welcome to another Zion's Banner broadcast, straight from the wonderful living room of the Steiners, who have graciously allowed their living room to be turned into a studio. Again, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and look for Jeff Cran, or to go to the website, zionsbanner.org. We're now posting the PowerPoints for these studies up. So you can have the notes and the PowerPoint as a PDF for your very own. And so that's available to you. We're excited about that. We're excited about a few other things, and I want to do a little housekeeping. I am excited about an upcoming conference that will be held on Muslim evangelism in February the 23rd and 24th. With a bunch of the apologists from the Valley that end up dealing with this. So this is kind of a joint conference today. The Friday will be held at Hillside Southern Baptist at 1344 West Thunderbird. So if you're in the Valley, please go ahead and join us at Hillside Southern Baptist. I'm so excited about the spiritual family that we're finding there, and it's been wonderful to be able to be a part of helping to encourage those brothers and sisters. The Saturday will be held from 10 to 5 p.m. at the First Arabic Church at 2232 West Campbell. More information will be available on our website. But I am excited. A lot of the issues that come up in Islam are issues that come up in Jewish apologetics. Now, they're not stated the same way, but what you're going to see tonight is that actually these issues, although sometimes stated differently, actually do come up, and actually you're going to see that polemicists from Islam ended up borrowing arguments from Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, and polemicists from rabbinical Judaism ended up borrowing some concepts from Islam. We are real excited. I'm really excited about this because this is a 4-part series. We're going to be dealing with several things. Now tonight we're going to be laying foundation. A good apologetics argument lays foundation. Now we always do the exegesis on a passage or related passages, and then we go ahead and talk about the apologetics as it relates to that passage or passages, and then we go ahead and we make some personal applications. So it's exegetical. I don't want to say apologetical because it sounds like I'm apologizing. I'm not apologizing for what I believe, but in terms of a defense of the faith is given, and then actual application. So this is kind of exciting. This is tonight's laying the foundation. The next message, which is next week, please turn in, is there clear scriptural language that points to the Incarnation. I've subtitled that, How Does an Invisible God Walk? Or The Mysterious Prophecy of Malachi. The third one is the way the whole canon and the theophanies point to an eventual incarnation, and that's called When God Visits. So please join us if you can. Whatever you cannot join us for, do not worry, because we post these online at www.zionsbanner.org. So I'm thrilled for everyone who joins, I'm thrilled for everyone who watches, and I'm thrilled for everybody in the room. Let's kind of get started tonight. We're going to be dealing with the issue of in the Incarnation and idolatry, are they the same thing? Let me tell you why we start there. Because that's where a lot of the objections end up occurring. So the first thing we need to do is, the objections usually center around idolatry is false worship and improper doctrine. The Incarnation is idolatry, therefore the Incarnation is improper doctrine and worship. That's kind of the way the argument goes. Now, I said we always go to Scripture. How do we define idolatry? Well, let's define it by using Scripture. Let's go to a scriptural precedent that was idolatrous and see what that actually ends up being. Now, a real key text for this is the incident of the golden calf. If you want a picture of what idolatry looked like in reference to how God views it, you could find no better example than Israel's worship of the golden calf. And if you're sitting there with your electronic Bible, you're going to want to go to Exodus 32. If you have the analog version of the Bible, you're still going to go to Exodus 32. See how that works? Electronics doesn't change everything. And we're going to look at the incident of the golden calf, and we're going to unpack this and look at this stunning example of what idolatry is and draw some conclusions from it that will help us define idolatry, and then we'll look at why a reasonable argument can be made that the Incarnation is not idolatry. You have the whole text sitting in front of you. If you're looking at particularly, we're going to go down to the very beginning of this incident. Now the people saw that Moses was delayed in coming down from the mountain. The people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, let us make gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." That's kind of the backdrop of the passage. If you're following along with the PowerPoints, you may see an extra slide or two. I apologize for that. But you should be looking at the slide that says the background of the passage. You need to understand what's going on here. A lot of times when we look at the Israelites, we sort of don't understand where they're coming from. What we need to understand is that these people have been enslaved for over 400 years. Moses provided strong leadership. He's taken them out. They're very dependent on Moses. Moses goes up to receive the Torah. This is a very important event. And he's been there a while. This is kind of problematic. The rabbis like to make a lot out of Aaron, but really Aaron is not the leader Moses is. And Aaron's leadership is a little weaker, and people do not know what's happened to Moses. He's been up there a while. And so, in the absence of leadership, people who've been beaten down for 400 years start to get some ideas that aren't really all that kosher. You also need to realize that Moses is getting the Torah while this incident of idolatry is going to end up happening. So that's highly sort of significant too when you juxtaposition the two together. That's the background. Let's look at the actual incident. You should be looking at the slide that says the incident. That helps, right? I'm not brilliant. Just love to go ahead and share this stuff. Aaron said to them, "Break off the earrings in two." It says, "Break off the earrings from the ears of your wife, your sons, your daughters, bring them to me." And so all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt." And so when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Notice in most of your translations that's all in capital letters. That's not accidental. That's that sacred name of God. And we're going to draw some conclusions from that this evening. We're going to draw at least a few conclusions. Now, again, I only borrow from the best, right? But I always give you the cross-references and citations, because it's not about being brilliant, it's about being able to proclaim and defend the faith. And it's about being able to tell the big story. The motto of my ministry essentially is making much of Messiah through God's big story, or through the meta-narrative of Scripture. The first thing we need to note is that the idol was formed as a physical representation for God in Moses' physical absence. Now listen to that closely. It was formed as a physical representation for God, not for another God. The idol was credited with the miracles performed by Moses' hand, i.e. the deliverance from Egypt, 32:1. Okay? Moses is still acting as priest. It's interesting. He forms the altar. He proclaims the feast. He's still acting in his role as high priest. but that role is being misused. But he's still functioning in that role as high priest. Sacrifice and ritual are kept intact, but they're ended up being misappropriated is the best word that I can go ahead and come up with. We didn't get all the way to verse 6 and 8 and 18, but you can go ahead and see from that passage as you look at that ritual and sacrifice are still being preserved intact. They're being misdirected and misappropriated. Aaron identifies the idol with Adonai. Most of your versions will say Yahweh. If I was going to pronounce that name at all in Hebrew, I'd pronounce it Yahweh, because I know that King David was not King Dawid, and so the Vav is pronounced as a V. I know some people dispute that. Sorry, I beg to differ. Those points do not come from me. They come from the Lexham Bible Dictionary, and you can look under polytheism and end up seeing those points. Now, how does that help us? We need to see how that helps us. We need to see that the scenario shows that the Israelites were not rejecting Adonai, the Lord, outright. Rather, they had absorbed them into their synchronistic, polytheistic worldview. See, you took the Israelites out of Egypt, but you didn't take the Egypt out of the Israelites. And so they had absorbed pagan false thinking and went ahead, and what they did is they synchronized this pagan false thinking with the one true God in his worship. So they're not attempting to create a different God per se, but they're misrepresenting the one true God by adding him to a polytheistic pantheon. Now that's terribly important in defining what idolatry is. Often I've wondered, why a calf? Why a bull? There were a lot of theories out there. I borrowed from Bruce Scanlon in the Holman, basically the Illustrated Bible Dictionary. He points out that the bull was considered a symbol of strength and productivity in the ancient world. There were some commentaries that said, but a calf is kind of weak and really can't do much on its own. I went, yeah, but a calf is still a bull in the making. And so I went ahead and thought to myself, maybe what we're dealing with is a representation of a bull. The funny thing is, the problem with bulls aren't that they aren't strong, it's that they're dumb. So you have a symbol for God's strength. Now remember, these people are just coming out of Egypt. What did they see of God's attribute? They saw his mighty hand. Didn't God say to Moses, with a mighty arm I will lead the children out of Egypt? They saw his might. A bull is a symbol of strength. They picked one attribute. They ignored that bulls are stupid and God isn't dumb. And that plays into idolatry. What idolatry is and what idolatry isn't. The conclusion is idolatry is false worship or misrepresenting the one true God. So when we say, is the incarnation idolatrous, what we're really asking is it a misrepresentation of God to believe that he could incarnate himself? And that's really what we have to focus on when that charge is raised. So how do we deal with this? Well, let's talk about the case against incarnation. Rabbinical Judaism disaccepted or rejected incarnation. They did so on the basis that it violated God's unity and his uniqueness. Well, how in the world does incarnation violate his unity? Because it implies in their mind polytheism. Now we're going to argue that there really is no polytheism involved, neither is there a misrepresentation of God, but let me expose you to their thinking so that you understand. Apologetics has to do with knowing the truth, but understanding what your audience is thinking so that you can bring the truth to bear and expose the thinking that is out of line. And we do ourselves no favor as believers when we don't understand other points of view and seek to build a bridge by which the truth can be commended to the mind and heart of man. In fact, I've heard it defined that persuasion is the art of moving truth around other men's roadblocks. But if we don't know where the roadblocks are, we can't move the truth around them. So what is the thinking? Well, the Jewish objection would go like this. If man is God while God is God, that would imply more than one deity. If the Incarnation implies that man became God and God is God, then you have this man who is God and God being God at the same time, and now you have another deity. This is a major bone of contention that ends up occurring. The other problem is, can man become God? Does it imply that because a man is God, that God became man? Now that's a misunderstanding of the definition of incarnation, and we'll end up dealing with that. The Muslim objections are much the same. A violation of God's attributes. Now, we're not talking about the God of the Bible. If you want more information on that, go to zionsbanner.org, where I address that as a Muslim conference. Is Allah the God of the Bible? And present a good case in terms of correspondence of attributes. In other words, the God of the Bible has certain qualities, and Allah would have to have the same qualities. And I'm not going to get too far into that. But that's a fun message, and I had a blast doing that in Anaheim, California. But the Muslims throw in this concept of association. You are making partners with Allah. Now, that doesn't start in some early polemics from Jewish authors. But what's fascinating to me is that medieval Jewish polemicists against Christianity begin to catch up on the concept of association and begin to talk about the concept of association. So you have Muslims who are opposed to faith in Jesus as the Messiah, borrowing from Jews who had discussions when Christianity started to grow and Messianic faith started to grow in the Jewish community. And then you have Jewish medieval philosophers and writers and rabbis borrowing from Islamic thought during the Middle Ages. And actually it's become more of a modern argument. Let's talk about it in terms of Islam. I have to introduce you to the term shirk. By the way, this is the one unforgivable sin in Islam. This is why Christianity is such an issue, why Jesus being God is such an issue for the Muslim, because it is an unforgivable sin. Shirk is unforgivable according to Islam. Let me quote from an article from Thought Inc. Related to the term shirk. The most fundamental article of faith in Islam is the belief in strict monotheism. Now understand that's defined by Islam as a Unitarian monotheism. That's a monotheism that is one God, one person. Okay, just so that you understand that. Okay, the opposition to, and they have a word for the unity of God. We would say the echad of God in Hebrew, but there's an Arabic term, tahid. I'm probably mispronouncing it, so forgive my butchered Arabic. You are now allowed to butcher one Hebrew word if you're an Arabic speaker, and I will work more on my Arabic pronunciation as I hang around more fellow apologists. But that term is known as shirk, or associating partners with Allah. It's also translated as polytheism. Shirk is the one unforgivable sin in Islam. If one dies in this state, associating a partner or others with Allah is a rejection of Islam and takes one outside the faith. The Quran, I'm quoting from the Quran, it's a version of the Quran, Surah 4, verse 116, "Verily, verily, Allah forgives not the sin of setting partners in worship with Him, but He forgives whom He wills. But he who forgives whom He wills, sin other than that, whatever one sets up partners in worship with Allah, indeed has strayed from the path." The path is reference to Islam and the faith. The bottom line is it's the one unforgivable sin. Jews will die with the Shema on their lips. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Rabbinical Judaism took incarnation to be a violation of that, and also a lessening of God and who he is. And so you will hear Jewish people who are not even believers in Messiah go ahead and reject Christianity as being idolatrous. And that takes us to what we mean by the incarnation. Most of the objections against the incarnation are based on a misunderstanding of the incarnation. First of all, let us be careful what we say. Do understand that when you're talking to an unbeliever about the incarnation, and that believer isn't from a church background, they may not understand at all what you mean by incarnation. So let's take Karnos is flesh. We're saying God infleshed himself. We're saying that God, I want to be careful how I want to put this because I need to stay within doctrinal orthodoxy as we understand it, but God came as a man. Here's what we're not saying. Man became a God. See, that's Mormonism. Mormonism is that man can become God. We in no means believe that when we're talking about the incarnation. That's a false doctrine. We're not going to get into that per se, but we need to understand that it's God coming as a man. I can't begin to tell you these sorts of objections you get. One of the beauties is that philosophy is very useful to pastors. I wish more pastors knew a little philosophy because they could be a little clearer about avoiding misrepresentations of doctrine. God has certain attributes that make him God, that are unique to him as God. Okay? We call those essential properties in philosophy. They're attributes that only God... They're things that make God God. Now let's think of a few things that are related. First of all, Jeff is a male. I know that this issue of gender has become a big thing, but let me assure you that Jeff Cran is male. I not only feel male today, I am completely male. I will be male tomorrow, and I'm not even going to check with my feelings. I just know I'm male, and that's okay. That's an essential property of Jeff. Okay. Jeff is not Jeff if he's not male. Jeff Cran would not be Jeff Cran if he was not male. That's an essential attribute. Okay? Jeff didn't used to have gray hair. There are actually pictures of me with non-gray hair. There are actually pictures of me with a Jew fro, but we're not going to ever show those to human beings because that's like scary. Okay. But at one time I did not have gray hair. We call those accidental properties. Those are properties that can change. When we're talking about the incarnation, we are saying that God added properties to his essential properties. Okay? God allowed himself to have properties that are not required for him to be God. What we are not saying is that man who has certain properties took upon himself or got divine properties that are restricted to being essential properties of God alone. Now that's a little bit of philosophy, but philosophy and theology really kind of go together. And so we have to be careful what we're saying and what we're not saying. And the reason I'm laying this foundation is, before we can talk about language in the scriptures that indicate incarnation, we have to know what incarnation is, and we have to know what incarnation isn't. Okay? And we have to know what idolatry is, and we have to know what idolatry isn't. Or we can't talk intelligently. The first step in having a conversation with someone about spiritual things is being able to define your categories. You have to be able to speak. You have to understand the language they're speaking, and you have to understand the language you're speaking, and then you have to be able to translate a little bit. So we had to take this first episode. It might not have been as exciting as might have been wanted, to define our territory so we can map things out. All right. Now, what's a preliminary response to this being idolatry? Idolatry is false worship, isn't it? It's making God a representation of God that is inaccurate. So let's ask the question. Now, we're making what's called a plausibility argument. Now, you guys, people use this all the time. If you told me the moon was made out of green cheese, I would say that's impossible. I would say that it is implausible or impossible for the moon to be made out of green cheese, based on other facts I know. Okay? But if it is possible that something is true, and there is evidence that it is true, then it is right and logical to believe that it is true. So we're starting with plausibility, then we're looking at verification, then we're moving to this is a true thing. So let's ask, is it plausible that God could incarnate himself? Well, let's try a light to heavy argument. Now, Jesus used this all the time. Okay, the Hebrew term for this is kol v'chomer. You can go light to heavy or heavy to light, but it's a kol v'chomer type of argument. We know from Genesis chapter 1 that human beings are made in God's image. We know that from Genesis chapter 1. So is it plausible that God can incarnate himself? Remember, we're starting with plausibility, we're moving to verification, and then we go ahead and have our argument all in order. Since human beings are made in God's image, is it implausible that God would be able to represent himself as one of those image bearers? If the lesser is true, that man is made in God's image, then the greater should be true, that God can represent himself or can come in the form of man. So you see, it is plausible from a light to heavy argument, man being made in God's image, to God being able to represent himself, that the incarnation is plausible. And that's all we're going to this week, is the plausibility. The verification side of the argument we will take in terms of the whole canon, because we talk in terms of God's big story, and we'll take in terms of looking at some specific language in scriptures that indicate an incarnation. And by the way, I'm not even going to the New Testament. I'm just going to stick in the Hebrew scriptures and Tanakh for all of this, which is terribly handy. Okay, let's get some application, because I want you to take something into your week. I want you to have this stuff, but this stuff does relate to our lives. If idolatry is the misrepresentation of God's character, then the question for us who follow God is, in what ways are you misrepresenting God to other people or to yourself? Because we all can enter into behavior that is idolatrous when we misrepresent God. So there's our application. We need to represent God properly so that the world does not get an idolatrous or false image of God. We need to represent God properly because we're image bearers. And we know after tonight that it is plausible that the incarnation could happen. We'll look at some cool stuff that indicates language that indicates the incarnation is biblical, and also that all of the scriptures lead up to that ultimate representation of God that we know as the incarnation. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. There are exciting things coming up with the conference. As always, you can go to our website, you can get the PowerPoint for tonight, and you can get this broadcast. Thank you again, and shalom, shalom.